So my name is Suzanne Sanders. This is part 2 of Friending Shakespeare. I'm so glad to see you guys back again. Did anybody hear any iambic pentameter out in the wild this week? Did you find yourself noticing the rhythms of English? I know that some of you exposed yourself to Shakespeare in other ways. So we were just talking about Susan checking out reduced Shakespeare, and Don referring to the Shakespeare in the original Klingon from Star Trek. Yeah, Shakespeare's out there. Last time we talked about what's so great about Shakespeare with his magical words and his world creating and why he was worth your time. Now I'm going to encourage you to see the plays for yourself. Seeing them is great. You get so much help when the plot gets tangled by watching the actors. It's so much easier to keep track of all those Henrys and Richards and everything in the history plays if you have an actor that you can look at and say, okay, that guy is the one. Not to mention all those Elizabeths. Let me put on, I'm going to share my screen with you here. The English are crazy about names for aristocrats. You start with a name like Albert Windsor, but if you get a title like Duke of York, then you have another name and people call you York. They stop calling you Windsor, they start calling you York. If you get to be king, you pick out a whole new name. So it's very important when you're seeing plays to look at the list of names and notice the titles, because sometimes they'll talk about York, sometimes they'll talk about Windsor, sometimes they'll talk about George. It's all the same guy. And often they'll refer to like Milan, which is a city-state at the time. And they're talking about the person. But the reason that they're combining the name and the person like that is that they believed that there was a mystical connection between the ruler and the land, that if the ruler was good and healthy and strong, that the land would be good and healthy and strong. And if you had a crappy ruler, then you would have all kinds of problems in your world. So I just pulled up this picture of King George VI and what everybody would be calling him: Daddy, Father, Bertie, because his first name was Albert. So let's stop share here. So, you know, pay attention to the list of titles. That idea that the power and the goodness and the troubles all flowed down from the king was called the Great Chain of Being. There's God at the top, and then the ruler, the king or queen, and then there are the aristocrats, and then the middle class, and then the lower class, and then the beggars, and way down at the bottom, there are the actors and playwrights, and below them, the animals and the plants. It was like a whole chain, and supposedly everything good would trickle down from the top all the way down to the bottom. And so the question of who's in charge, who's in power, was very, very important to them. They felt like it was a personal problem if the king wasn't legitimate, say, if he'd gotten in unfairly. They worried a lot when Queen Elizabeth was queen because she had no heir. And it was kind of like, well, where are the good things going to come from once she dies? And how are we going to live? So there was a lot of anxiety at the time. And you can feel that in a lot of the history plays in particular. People keep talking about who's in charge with a sense of it being a very personal problem. And it's not just that, you know, they're watching the news kind of thing. It's that they really felt that their personal fortunes were tied up with the whole system there. It wasn't very common to move in the system. Yeah, Sam. I can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. I think maybe Sam's having trouble hearing me.
Yes.
There you go.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Can we put that idea in the context of Richard III for a moment?
Sure.
Was like, disabled and machinacious, I guess. What did that, does that fit in with the
yeah, it does fit in with that. They were very bigoted in one respect. They really felt like people who were in any way differently abled were not as good for positions of power.
Right.
The fact that Richard III was an incredible soldier was basically what got him over a lot of the resistance to him being in power. When they found his bones under the car park in Leicester,
when that was found.
Yeah, they actually looked, and he did have severe scoliosis. And they went out and they did an experiment. They found somebody with an equal amount of scoliosis who was about the same age as him and who had never gotten treatment for it. And they taught him how to fight like a medieval warrior. And he was awesome. He riding horses, fighting with his sword, just doing the whole thing just like Richard III. Because some people had said there's no way he could have had that sort of a disability and still been that sort of a fighter. And they proved that, yes, he could. The thing was, for Shakespeare, he knew his audience. They would automatically think that the idea of having someone like that in power would mean that it was maybe questionable that the benefits of the Lord would rain down on them, that somehow they would be kind of deflected by the way he was. And so Shakespeare really leans on it. He emphasizes it. He describes it as if it's much worse than it actually was. And, basically turns him into an evil guy because the people who killed him were the people in power, Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. So in Shakespeare, Richard III is nothing but an evil bunchback toad, as they call him.
Yeah, the twisted body and the twisted mind.
Yep. They did have a belief that you could read the soul on the face. If you were lovely, then you were a good person. If you were strong and handsome, then you were obviously doing the right thing. Shakespeare was one of the first to start bringing in the idea that somebody could look a little different and still be good.
Oh, right, like Othello.
Yep, like Othello. Yeah, you got it. So that was a very new idea, but he brought it in very small bites, so.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly. I recommend you going out for the plays because of things like this. You can see how people can move around. When you read about Richard III, you read about somebody that sounds like, how can he walk across the street? But when you see an actor working around the setup, like Anthony Sher one time did Richard III with crutches, the European style crutches that strap onto your forearms.
Yeah.
And he was very powerful and very fast. And the effect of it was he was like a spider running around on the stage, and he was scary. And you really got a sense of how strong he was, which Shakespeare doesn't make him out to be a weakling. He makes him out to be very strong, very smart, very charismatic. I mean, he seduces all the women around, that you would think would hate his guts. So he's giving him other qualities than the ones that people expect. The people of the time would expect a bad guy to have bad qualities. That's it. So he started giving the bad guys some good qualities, and good guys some bad qualities. He's famous for blending in all ways. There's comedy in the tragedies. There's tragedy in the comedies. He did that partially just to give you a break, so you can kind of get back to being ready to accept the next joke if you're in a comedy, and he got some relief from the evil happenings in a tragedy. But there's also something else that happens. Phoebe Waller-Bridge, the creator of Killing Eve and Fleabag, said that the power of comedy is astonishing to me, how it can disarm the audience and leave them wide open and vulnerable. Now, Shakespeare knew this. If he brought in something that was funny and people were laughing, they're not defending themselves from the ideas that are being presented. So he can slip in, a little bit of this kind of unusual thinking that he had for the time. He softens us up with a joke. He brings out our feelings, helping. It can help, actually, if you see it with a friend. This is an odd thing to recommend, but a lot of times seeing Shakespeare with a friend helps, because everybody laughs more when they're in a crowd. If it's a sad part, having somebody there to kind of pat you on the shoulder or nod that, yeah, it's getting to them too, that helps. It makes it more of an emotional flow to the experience. And you can share popcorn and talk about it after. So what should you start with? Let's see, comedy, tragedy, history. Those are the traditional three areas that plays are put in. They're guideposts, but they're not strict for Shakespeare. Did you have something to say, Sam?
Yeah, I was reading the introduction to Measure for Measure, the one they're doing it in, I believe it's Centerville, the Shore Shakespeare setting up there.
Yeah.
And that one is referred to as a tragic comedy.
Yeah. They're really hard to classify in Shakespeare. Usually the comedies are mostly funny. They're mostly happy. They usually end with a wedding of some sort. A director, Joseph Papp, said that Shakespeare comedies are like Irish coffee. They've got that bitter coffee and whiskey. That's the emotions and the feelings underneath. And it's kind of sweetened up with this froth of whipped cream witticism on top. So you don't get just the sweetness. You don't get just the funny. You get both. The tragedies are mostly sad. They can be very gory. But it was a rough time. So if you didn't die, that made it a comedy. Everybody says, how can Merchant of Venice be a comedy? Well, mostly people don't die in the Merchant of Venice, so it's a comedy. That's how rough it was then. They thought that was enough to make something a comedy. Yay. With the histories, the one thing you need to know is who's got this? Who's got the crown? Who's allowed to wear it? Who's wearing it the right way? who's wearing it the wrong way, who doesn't know what to do with it, who's passing it off, who's stealing it. The crown is the big important thing. Shakespeare was happy to tell you all about what happens when somebody takes power and sneaks in. He was happy to tell you about what happens when a tyrant takes over and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. He was not factual. You can't watch Shakespeare and get actual history. You can get a version of it, but it's being used in the service of the story he's telling. If you get stuck in a history, watch the body language. If two characters spend all their time hanging around together, they're probably allies. If they are constantly bickering, well, you know they're not on the same side. You can watch who runs away, who hides, you know, and figure it out that way. So how to pick a good video. You look for good actors and directors. Now, a lot of people in Hollywood are not trained to be Shakespearean actors. It does take a bit of training because you have to learn how to breathe correctly to get through those long lines and make them sound like natural speech. We tend to talk in shorter little sentences, so a lot of people can't handle that. Also, movie actors do what they call park and bark. They stand somewhere, give their big line, and then they move and do something. And then they give another line, and then they move and do something. Well, if you do that in Shakespeare, it takes 500 years to get through all the plays. You have to move and talk at the same time to keep the action going. Another thing Hollywood movies sometimes do is they will have the whole text. They'll show everything. And since Shakespeare is talking about everything, you're basically getting everything repeated. And it can make what's a fast moving story strangely slow. So if the edition that you have seems boring, get another one. It doesn't mean the play is boring. It just means that that particular edition isn't right for you. Yes, Susan.
We watched Much Ado About Nothing.
Okay.
With Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, Denzel Washington, and Keanu Reeves. It was really entertaining. And
I like that one a lot.
It's fun. And I was saying, my husband and I were saying, wow, learning those lines is a challenge, right? I mean, some of the speeches are very long and they're, you know, they're not, they don't flow easily. So, but it's a good one. I think I think it was on Amazon Prime. We found it. Yep. So.
Actually, I'm going to be giving you in a minute here a list of a few suggestions for ones to start with, and that's on the list.
Oh, good.
A good thing about that one too is it has a lot of American actors on it, and a lot of people in America find it easier to understand what people are saying if it just happens to be in an American accent. As much as I love British dramas and everything, I can pick things up quicker when it's an American actor. So sometimes that helps. You can ask at the library, ask friends for recommendations. There are websites like Shakespeareances.com that is very good for giving an analysis of different versions. You can sample them, you know, look at them online. And so I'm going to give you some of my faves here. Where am I? First, some fun with Shakespeare. This isn't individual plays. These are more general. There's Shakespeare Uncovered 1, 2, and 3. This was a fantastic PBS series. It's got 3 or 4 plays per episode. It's just an hour long. It talks about the high points and the important themes and whatnot of the plays, but it gives you lots of clips of the stars and everything. Shakespeare in Love. It imagines the inspiration for Romeo and Juliet. Yep, that one's a good one. Shakespeare Retold. That's a retelling of 4 of the plays as modern stories. And that can be very telling once you have the language stripped away and you just look at the plot. It shows you both what's going on, but it also gives you a sense of what you're missing. Looking for Richard, that's Al Pacino trying to make Richard III more accessible to modern audiences. And that's kind of a documentary as well as having clips of the actual movie. Renaissance Man, that's a comedy with Danny DeVito teaching a bunch of misfits in Army boot camp, supposedly just teaching them some English, but they latch on to Shakespeare and it's great. And Still Dreaming. They put on Midsummer Night's Dream at a retirement home, and they find that it does amazing things for the people acting and for the people in the audience. Then there are some single plays. I'm not going to describe all these. You can look at the details on the video they'll send you. There's Chimes at Midnight, 1965. That combines all of the Falstaff plays. Coriolanus in 2012, that has Ralph Fiennes in it. Hamlet, 1996, that's the big one that has Nothing Left Out with Kenneth Branagh. Hamlet in 1990, that's with Mel Gibson. Hamlet in 2009 with David Tennant, that's very edgy, that's a fun one. Henry V, that's a big Hollywood epic style with Kenneth Branagh. There's a series called Hollow Crown that was on PBS. It combines the different history plays and it takes out a lot of the text and turns it into visual, it's a movie, definitely. But it gives you the real flow of it and it really doesn't feel like it cuts you short. Julius Caesar, there's one from 2017 that was done in a women's prison. That's very powerful. King Lear in 2008 with Ian McKellen. Macbeth in 2016. That's the one I mentioned earlier that it's like you can tell PTSD in there. Well, I was talking about Coriolanus, but this one also, you can see that he knew about PTSD in this one. The Merchant of Venice, 2000. This is one most people don't know about, but it's very good because Antonio is very strong. The Merchant of Venice is Antonio. It's not Shylock the Jew. So having a strong Antonio is very interesting. There's The Merchant of Venice in 2005 with Al Pacino. William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1999. That's a real sexy one. That's fun. Midsummer Night's Dream in 2018. That's set in the present time. Kind of an interesting contrast. Much Ado About Nothing, as Susan mentioned. That's a real goodie. Richard III with Ian McKellen from 1995. That's set in an imagined fascist England. And the thing that's helpful about that one is they change all the thous to yous. And some people, that makes a big difference. And there's Romeo and Juliet from 68 with real teens playing the teen lovers. There's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet. That's the Baz Luhrmann spectacle. Taming of the Shrew from 67. Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton. What else do I need to say? The Tempest from 2017. That's got movie quality special effects and superb acting. Twelfth Night from 2012. That's an all-male performance at the Globe, done original style, works better than you'd think. And Twelfth Night from 1997 or 96. That's a really sweet one with Imogen Stubbs. So any of those I would recommend highly. You might want to turn on the captions when you play them. If that helps you, if you can watch what's going on, though, you don't want to forget about what's going on. And remember that ancient technique, don't forget to breathe, don't forget to smile. If you have trouble hearing or understanding what they're saying on one version, you might try a different version. Sometimes the director doesn't really know what the story's trying to say. And then everybody sounds fuzzy and confused. Sometimes the sound editing isn't very good. There are a lot of versions out there where they just stuck a camera in front of a stage and recorded. And then even if it's good acting, the sound quality might be so poor that it won't do you any good. There's a series by the BBC back in the 80s. Some of them are good, but a lot of them are just boring as get out, because they just park the camera in one spot and everybody just talks like they would on stage, which is fine. But if they turn their heads, you can't hear what they're saying, and you're not close enough to really see their expressions. So if you don't like the version you have, stop it, try another one. I would say, though, try to give any version you watch 20 minutes. Give your ears and your brain time to tune in to what's going on. That's usually about enough to do it. All of the plays are edited. You'll see different versions that leave different things out or put different things in a different place. He meant his plays to be edited. I told you about the weather might come up. The other things that were important were if there's someone in the audience who's very important, a duke or something, he might put in a line or two to give a nod to the duke, or have the actors at least present certain parts to the duke. If there were hecklers, he'd call them out, point them out, and had those lines in there. The historical texts that we have, some of them were working printed texts, but some of them were actors remembering what they had heard other people saying. So there are some plays that all we have are these, what they call recollections. So like, say, Hamlet. Okay, we think of Hamlet like, let's do one. Okay. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. That's the full text. But then they also have a version that is one of these remembered texts, where some actor was listening in and running out and telling somebody who could write to write it all down as much as he could remember. And his version is, to be or not to be. Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep. Is that it? I all, yeah, no, to sleep, to dream. Aye, Mary, there, that's how it goes. It sounds like he's talking on a cell phone. It leaves out the poetry, it leaves out the beautiful language, it leaves out the depth. So occasionally you'll see a play and all they have for a section is one of these remembered bits. So it'll start feeling kind of thin compared to the rest of the play. So you just try a different version, someone who can work with it. Sometimes they go too far with the editing. I've seen versions where they cut out like whole characters and whole subplots, and it becomes very meager. Shakespeare loves to be generous. You don't want someone cutting everything out. The Taming of the Shrew, for instance, is almost always edited in a way that changes the meaning of the play. The original play has a frame story around it, where a guy is very drunk and they set this whole play up as a joke on him. And they make him think that he's a duke and he's having a play performed in his house and all of this. And they're making fun of the guy. And the guy, is so drunk, he thinks, oh, hey, yeah, I'm a duke. Okay, fine. And so that turns the whole play into a big practical joke. But if you cut out that frame story, then it becomes something very different. It becomes very threatening and almost abusive, things like that. It's a much more of a tragedy than a comedy once you take the frame story away. There's a long history of improving Shakespeare. Everybody wants to tinker. I think maybe his creativity rubs off on people. There are happy endings that have been tacked on to tragedies. King Lear, for instance, was not a tragedy for the first couple hundred years after it was written, because somebody came in and gave it a happy ending, and that was the way everybody watched it up until the 1800s. They often take the comedies, excuse me. They take the comedies nowadays and make them kind of bittersweet or, modern, urban, tough, that kind of thing. They don't want them to be too schmaltzy. The Falstaff plays, the Victorians took out all the references to sex in Shakespeare, and there was pretty much nothing left when Falstaff was talking once they took that out. Yeah, Sam.
I took a class in undergrad, Shakespeare, Sex and Gender. And one of the main things I remember from the class was that the word nothing, as Shakespeare is double entendre.
Yes.
That it's for vagina.
Yes, it is.
Like that puts much ado about nothing in a completely different context.
Sure does.
I'm going to be talking about jokes in just a little bit. You have hit the nail on the head. There are so many things that are jokes in there that just seem like, there's just straight lines.
Right.
But even the ones that are obvious, the Victorians just cut them all out. They cut out 2/3 of Shakespeare, basically, by cutting out everything they found either questionable or sexual. And they said they were doing it for the children. We've heard that argument. There were a lot of issues raised in these plays. Like the Victorians had the problem with sexuality there in the plays. At the time they were written, they brought up all sorts of issues, and they still bring up all those issues. Is Taming of the Shrew sexist? Is Othello racist? Is Merchant of Venice anti-Semitic? Was Shakespeare an elitist? Was he ageist? Did he shame the mentally ill? Would he be liberal or conservative if he came around today? These arguments are still out there. In his time, the theater was one of the few places you could talk about things like the government and whether it was being run right, or possibility of revolution or things like that, without being automatically thrown in jail. Shakespeare wanted them to talk, wanted them to have their chance to say things. And he also wanted to give a fair shot to both sides in some respects. He never let just one side of the argument get a say. He always had somebody at least pop in with the other side. He made unpopular views sympathetic and kind of keep the pot rolling. In England at the time, it had been 300 years since there were any Jews living there. So nobody knew any Jews. They had a long history of Jewish moneylenders being the evil villain in like church plays. So they were pretty well set up to think that any Jews were going to be evil. Christopher Marlowe came along with a play a few years before, and his Jew of Malta is just so stereotypical, you know, poisoning wells, killing children, all this kind of horrible stuff. And Shakespeare wanted to do something different. He gave the most beautiful speech of empathy for the other into the mouth of Shylock. We've all heard it. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the sun, and same winter and summer as a Christian is. He wanted you to have empathy for everyone. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to keep Shakespeare alive. Keeping that empathy alive is very difficult. Most plays don't make a point of bringing that out. You know, they either have a viewpoint that they're trying to bring across and they leave the empathy up to you, or they're just trying to get an emotion out of you and they're not really trying to balance it in any sense. Shakespeare's characters all have different facets. Shylock is a horrible person in some respects, but because of this speech, you get a sense of he's good in other respects. The good guys do bad things, bad guys do good things. It makes it tricky if you're going to quote somebody from Shakespeare to give advice, because a lot of times the bad guys give the best advice. So you gotta watch out. They really do. You know, you can have a perfectly good quote, and then you find out it was said by Timon of Athens or something, you know, and, you know, who turns out not to be a very, very nice guy. Excuse me. You can use the plays to argue any side of any argument you want. He wanted to have both sides of the controversy to keep things rolling, so you could really get a good view of it. There's a play, Sir Thomas More, where Shakespeare didn't write the whole play. He was brought in to write basically the high point of the play, to give the big emotional scene a punch. And it's the only thing we have in his actual handwriting. Well, only play we have in his actual handwriting. We have signatures from him and things like that. The story of the play is there's a riot over asylum seekers. And this was based on a true occurrence. A whole bunch of people were coming to England seeking asylum, and the people already living there started rioting because so many people were coming in. Thomas More was the sheriff of London. So he's trying to calm the crowd. He says, imagine that you see these wretched strangers, their babies on their backs and their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation. And he says, if you just arrogantly put up the doors and not allow any of them, what do you have? You have proof that insolence and a strong hand should rule. And down the road, in the future, what if that comes back to bite you? Maybe in the same way, other ruffians would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes would feed on one another. He asks, if you were a refugee, where would you go? What country would want you? Why, you must needs be strangers, finding no abode on earth. Detested knives held against your throats, spurned like dogs. So you might think from that Shakespeare was pro-immigrant. But there are other parts of the plays where he gives big voice to English exceptionalism, that the English are better than anyone on earth. He often lets the commoners get the wisest word in the argument. He has characters put down hasty Germans and blunt Hollanders, bragging Spaniards. He calls Greece insolent, Denmark rotten, calls France a dog hole. He says the French are arrogant, touchy, pompous, confident, and over lusty, ridiculous when they try to speak English, untrustworthy. His character says it's better to use France than to trust France. That doesn't sound like somebody who loves immigrants. So he gives different sides. And depending on what the director wants to do with the play, you may get more or less of one view. And depending on your own beliefs and experiences, you may focus on more of one view or the other. Shakespeare's kind of slippery that way. He isn't in the business of telling you what to think. He's in the business of telling you to think and to feel. Yes, Susan.
Just wondering if you think that has something to do with the fact that in this book that I was referencing before, they talk about him really being a marketing genius.
Oh,
so
he's brilliant.
In the fact, in the fact that he appeals to both sides, he's also engaging the whole audience, right? Because he's, if he gives
wants
one side,
everybody to come in. Yeah.
Right. He doesn't want to alienate, the left or the right. He makes sure that he includes all of that, and that's part of his marketing, right?
Oh yeah, he was brilliant about that. Butts in the seats. That was the thing. You can't reach anybody if they're not in the theater. So the first trick is to get them in the theater. And he was just a master at that. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So what do you think? Can a writer truthfully write about somebody who's different from himself? A lot of people assume that, if Shakespeare says X in a character's mouth, that's Shakespeare's view. Some people nowadays feel like maybe he's kind of questionable because of some of the things his characters say. What do you think? Any feelings on that? Well, I say, of course, a writer can write about people that are different from himself or herself. He had great powers of observation and imagination, so he could expand on what he observed. The great ones can step outside their own shoes. And to be frank, it's ridiculous to think that anything one of his characters says something about what he believed. He had 1,223 different speaking characters in his plays that we know of. That's a lot of viewpoints. And he doesn't have very many speaking characters that have no personality or no viewpoint. Usually everybody's an individual. I think he was just a really good observer and really good at figuring out human psychology. I held a mirror up to nature, as it were. So these plays can invite hard discussions, but they can also give possible solutions. Can't settle our controversies for us, but give us a way to talk about them that maybe isn't as hard as direct address. There is a play coming up this week on PBS. Merry Wives is going to be on great performances on Saturday or Friday, the 20th at 9 o'clock. I would love it if you guys would watch it. It's definitely a comedy. It's a lightweight one. This is one that supposedly Queen Elizabeth liked Falstaff so much. She said, "Mr. Shakespeare, write me another Falstaff play," where Falstaff is in love. And so he took the challenge, of course, command performance, as it were, and came up with Merry Wives of Windsor. The thing to keep in mind about any of the plays that focus on women in particular back then is that Elizabethan women did not control their own destiny as much as they might. The girl was the possession of the father. Boys were considered possessions of the father, but were given a certain amount of legal leeway to have an opinion. The girls were not allowed to have an opinion. Marriage was a contract between families. It wasn't about who loved each other. Now, of course, nobody wants the trouble of having a whole bunch of miserable people around all the time. So most fathers would try to find somebody that the daughter would like. And, you know, if you like him, yeah, they wouldn't ask for love. They're constantly asking in the plays, do you like him? You know, it wasn't a matter of, are you in love? It was, can you live in the same house and not drive the rest of us crazy? It was pretty much about money. Love was not the reason for marriage. It was to tie families together for power and money and for the legitimacy of the children to follow. These were all very important at the time, so that was what they focused on. The husband had control over all of the wife's assets once they were married. If it were an aristocratic woman, she might have control over some of her own money or some of her own lands even after she were married. But all of that took extra legal wrangling and everything. And it was mostly because she had a big, powerful family that would come and kick his butt if he messed with her stuff too much. So that's the background of what's going on in the time. Yeah, Sam, did you have? Oh, I thought you were. Okay. In real life, a lot of the Elizabethan middle class and working class women actually had control over the purse strings in the house, mostly because they did all the purchasing. They did all the shopping and you know, getting the equipment and the clothing and everything. So in Merry Wives, one of the points is Falstaff thinks that he's going to have control of the money if he gets control of these two middle class women. You know, so he makes his play. There were plenty of love matches back then. People would elope and, you know, things like that. But they were considered criminals. They were considered outlaws. They were stealing from the father and the family, and they were disrupting that great chain of being because the benefits were going God, the king, all the way down through the men of the family. You know, they'd trickle out to the women after they went through all the men of the family. Queen Elizabeth I had an army and a navy, but she was still given a lot of grief for not acting natural like a woman and getting married and making herself subservient to some man. So that's going on in that play. That's the background. But I think you'll have fun with it. I don't know what they've done with this version because I haven't seen it before, so I'll be curious to talk about it. But I think it's time for another hat. Let's see. This is a good one.
The jester.
Oh, yes. Jesters were expected to entertain on command, whether it was jokes, pranks, silly dances, wry observations, riddles, acrobatics, music, whatever it took. Lots of wordplay, quibbling, as they called it, many puns. Yes.
Can I wear one too?
And there you go. Yep. They still had clowns that were, on the payroll at, people's houses just to entertain. It was like buying a television. It had something to do in the evenings. They had jesters who were called allowed fools. That meant that they were not only allowed to entertain, they were allowed to say whatever they wanted to. This was important back then because when everyone is watching what they say so they won't get on the wrong side of the people in charge, having one person who can say the hard truths really helped. They may not have always liked it, but it really helped. They were kind of like no men instead of yes men. Everybody else was yes men, and the allowed fools were the no men. The clowns and fools in Shakespeare are there to be funny, but they're also there to bring the wisdom. They just do it in between fart jokes. The humor really does range. It goes from frat boy sort of humor to very delicate observations of humanity. It's very light to dark. Sometimes it's physical pratfalls. Sometimes it's very witty and cerebral, but it's always appropriate to the situation and the characters. A high-placed lady is not going to make, a barf joke. So, yeah, that sort of thing. But it can often be quite earthy. They're not doing it just to be rude. People were very earthy then. It's bawdy, but not obscene. They did have a line to go over. It was considered a sign of an educated person to be able to say something completely rude, but do it in such a way that it sounded intellectual and fine. So Shakespeare makes sure he walks the line. He doesn't just come right out and become obscene. If you're easily shocked, stay away from Falstaff because he walks very close to the line. But for the most part in the plays, you can watch it with little children. It's like Warner Brothers cartoons where there are jokes in there that are for the adults. It just go right over the kids' heads and they don't realize anything's been said. But for the adults that get it, it's like, yeah, oh my God, yes. Some of the comedy from 400 years ago just doesn't make sense nowadays. There's a lot of slang that's changed, the pronunciation has changed, and the situations have changed. In As You Like It, there's a line, from hour to hour, we ripe and ripe, and from hour to hour, we rot and rot. Well, it sounds like it's a truism, but it doesn't sound funny. But at the time, it would have been very witty because their word for hour and their word for whore were pronounced the same way. The accent was just that much different. So, the person is making a commentary both about the time and about the activities of the time. Some parts that were not jokes then have become jokes now because the changes in the meaning of some of the words. So, keeps on being funny. And if you have good actors, they'll make it funny, even if it's no longer something that would be funny on the page. Still, it's more fun if you know what they were talking about. So let's talk about some of the things that Elizabethans found hilarious. Number one joke in Shakespeare. Cuckolds. That's their word for men who couldn't keep their wives interested. A man whose wife is unfaithful was considered comic gold then. They thought that was the funniest thing they had ever heard. They pictured cuckolds as having horns on their head. You'll see actors doing this, or they'll make jokes about horned animals like, deer or cows or whatever. It's kind of like when we imagine a good guy as a cowboy in a white hat or somebody with a halo over top of them. So that was their way of thinking of it. So if they start talking about horned animals, they're probably talking about cuckolds. Also, cuckoo birds, for some reason, were part of that joke. I don't know why, I can't explain it. But if they start going on about cuckoo birds, they're casting aspersions on somebody's ability to keep their wives interested. Joke number two, big joke number two, sex and all the related parts. They had so many euphemisms for everything involved with sex. If you don't get the joke, assume it's about sex. If they're talking about people standing, that's sex. They're talking about somebody arising. Well, of course, that's sex. If somebody's dying, they're talking about climaxing. If they're talking about peaches or medlar fruits, they're talking about the kind of fold that's in the fruit and discussing exactly what that resembles. Making a woman's acquaintance could mean having sex with her, because quaint at the time was a euphemism for female genitalia. Now, I think it's funny how that word has changed. Oh, it's so quaint. Well, I just crack up, I'm sorry. And as you mentioned before, thing is stand-in word for all sorts of unmentionables. And As You Like It, Rosalind is flirting with her crush, and she says to him, "Are you not good?" He says, "Well, I hope so." And she says, well, can one desire too much of a good thing? Respectable, noble women like Rosalind could joke about sex. They could make quite bawdy jokes, as a matter of fact. Couldn't avoid seeing it. They lived out in the open, and the animals are out in the open too, and everybody could see what was going on. They could talk about it all they liked, but they just couldn't do it. No sex before marriage. That was not done. That was dangerous. That could get you put in jail. That could get you killed. That could not be done. No joking matter. You do have to keep in mind, though, that love was used in a lot wider fashion than we use it, the word love. When they would say they love one another, they didn't necessarily mean being in love. They meant they were in some sort of a positive feeling towards one another. Best buddies could call each other in love. They'd say, "I love you." And it meant that they were really good friends. It didn't mean that they were in love. It didn't mean that they were having sex necessarily. It just meant that they were very close. If two aristocrats, like say two dukes, were saying, "I love you, I have love for you, let's increase our love," what they were talking about was being allies. They didn't mean that they had any kind of a personal feeling for one another. They meant in their position as a duke, they were positively framed towards the other person. So a lot of it can sound like bathroom humor, and a lot of it can sound like it's much more risque than maybe it is. But it's done with a precise touch suited to the character. Like in, oh, well, no, let's save that one. Let's do joke number 3. I don't want to skip this one. Joke number 3, Will. It's a good thing William Shakespeare was able to take a joke, because will was a euphemism for sexual desire, and for all the related naughty bits. In Twelfth Night, it's full of characters that all want to have people that they can't have. And the subtitle of that play is What You Will. You know, see what he did there? He stuck it right in there. It's just another euphemism. So if people are talking about being willing, or you will you, won't you, you know, they're probably talking about, all right, who do you got the hots for? Who do you want to go after? What's the deal here? So it's done with a precise touch, though. Like, let's see, Antony and Cleopatra. Okay, that's one that people don't often get to see. So let's have a little quote from Antony and Cleopatra. There's a scene where Antony is drunk, and his buddy Lepidus, you know, buddy in the sense of they're allies. They're not, you know, they love one another as allies. Lepidus is very, very drunk. And Antony has been talking about the wonders of Africa and telling him about all these crazy animals and everything. And so Lepidus says, what manner of animal is your crocodile? Antony says, it is shaped, sir, like itself. It is as broad as it has breadth. It's as high as it is high. It moves with its own organs. It lives by that which nourishes it. And the elements once out of it, it transmigrates. Lepidus says, and what color is it of? It is of its own color too. It is such a strange serpent. It is so, and the tears of it are wet. I've seen these two guys when I was working as a bartender. There'll be one guy saying the most obvious, uninformative things, and the other guy just in rapt attention watching him. It's one of the things I love about Shakespeare. You can tell he's kept his eye on people. You can really see where he's going with it. There's an author, Nori Epstein, who said, what makes Shakespeare unique is that he is capable of being tender, sexy, funny, and sad all at the same time. I think that's pretty much of a wonderful trait. So, how you guys doing on the jokes? I do hope you get a chance to see some plays live. When you can share it with the audience, it has so much more impact. Having the people laughing around you, it's like having a friend watching a video with you. It just helps. Yes, Susan.
I'm thinking about all these things that you're telling us, and we are noticing. I can't imagine what it was like during the Victorian era. If they took all of this out,
yeah,
they would lose completely the fun and the subtlety. I can't, is that what I mean? So well, then after they finally re-emerged as they are supposed to be?
Well, what happened was it became a time where the acting got very histrionic and melodramatic. You'd get a lot of posing, involved in it. It became a time with a lot of kind of star turns. People would have a big death scene, and then there would be a round of applause, kind of like an opera singer singing an aria. You got a break in the play during that. One of the big popular items during Victorian times was the fact that the women would play boys in some of the plays, and they would put them in these tights and real short pants, and the men just went nuts over getting to see the ladies' legs. So in spite of them cutting out all references to anything to do directly with sex, one of the major draws was the fact that you could see a woman's legs, which you never saw under normal circumstances. And so towards the end of the 1800s, about mid-century, I guess, really, they started getting people in that said, this just isn't making it. Let's have a fresh look back at the originals. And they started bringing in more and more of the plays, taking out the happy endings that had been tacked on. Some of them, they had put whole speeches in to change what different characters did. So they took care of all of that and moved it out. And over the course of the century, they got closer to the originals. And pretty much 20th century, it was just continuing that process. So
Thank you.
Yeah, there was actually a big riot in New York in, I think it was 1849, somewhere around that time. They actually the militia fired on the crowd. And the reason for the riot was there were two actors playing Macbeth in different theaters. And one was playing it in a very histrionic way, and the other one was playing it with the new realistic, quieter way. And one had become associated with American acting, and the other one associated with English acting. And the English and the Americans were kind of button heads at the time, and it turned into a riot because the Americans would charge the Englishmen and try to disrupt his show, and the English would disrupt the American show, and it became a big fight. Sorry about that. Once again, telemarketers. But if you're new to play going, I doubt any of you are, just make yourself comfy. Try to get yourself physically as comfy as possible before you go. Make sure you pick a spot where you can see and hear well, and give it a shot. If you hate it, you can leave at the intermission. If it's too much for you, no problem leaving at the intermission either. I have no problem with people turning off videos halfway through because they're like, this is too much for one shot. You just have to keep in mind, in Shakespeare, there's a lot of characters. So you'll probably have people doubling. So you'll have the same actor playing two different characters. And that's where, the clothing will come in as like a marker. You don't get that problem in movies, but you'll get it in live. I really hope that you also see the plays for people in the future, because the more we see them now, the more we keep them alive. The more they're willing to put them on, the more they'll carry them into the future for grandchildren, great-grandchildren, people down the road. I know it's a long drive to DC or Baltimore or Stanton or wherever, but we do have Shore Shakespeare coming here in the summer. So maybe we'll get to do that. Perhaps you've wondered why I haven't shown you like movie clips or shots from the movies, things like that. Why I'm just jawing on at length like this. And it's because I want you to get used to long speeches. Shakespeare has long speeches. And at first it's very daunting. It just turns into a blur of words. Your ear seems like it can't take it all in. So, maybe hearing somebody that's, conversational English, talking for a while, and kind of tune your ear up a little bit. I tell you, if you can imagine a laundry basket with a box in it as a theater, you'll do fine with Shakespeare. You got to kick your imagination in. So, do I have any questions for today? You guys have been wonderful about joining in. I appreciate all of that. Next time, we'll be talking about nibbling at Shakespeare, wrestling with his language, Quakers and pirates, choosing a book, and silly Elizabethan clothes. And here's a reminder, May the 20th on PBS, Merry Wives, 9 o'clock. I'm hoping we'll get to talk about it a bit next week. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. See you
It's
next
been
week.
fun. See you next week.
See you next week.